Okay, welcome to my latest video titled, Everyone Knows They Need a Savior, the Self-Evident Nature of the Christian Gospel. This comes after the video titled, Methodology, in which I established the rules of the debate surrounding the Bible's reliability before we entered it, saying that we should be using the same standard of judgment on it just as we would use on other documents. The end goal of that video was to take the edge off the innate hostility toward the Bible that many skeptics have. The purpose of this video is to make them actually want the Bible to be true. So this video addresses the question, how do I fix my sin? Which is defined as morally falling short. So if one aims an arrow at a target and it falls short, then one would say that they have sinned against the target. They have done things that they should not have done, or they have not done things that should have been done. So I do not mean sin in a religious sense, but I do mean it in a moral sense. If you believe that you have sinned at any point in time, then you meet what we call condition 1. And the rest of this argument applies to you. Perhaps you have snapped at someone after a long day at work, or slightly bent the truth to make you look better, or at least omitted those parts of the truth that make you look bad. Perhaps you have looked longfully at a person who isn't your spouse, or fudged those numbers on the tax return. Maybe, for argument's sake, your moral values are different, and you believe that it is right to hate others and be a jerk. If you have not hated others as you should at any point in time, then you have sinned. There is a moral target, and you have fallen short. So please take a moment and ask yourself, have I sinned? If you answered yes, then you meet condition 1. If you had to sit and think about it because you're not sure about some questionable thing you have done, then the answer is probably yes. If you answered no, if you are morally perfect in your own eyes, I encourage you to ask others if they think the same. If you're a married man, ask your wife if she thinks that. So, everyone meets condition 1. In case there's still doubt in your mind, then ask yourself the following questions. What do I think of others when they cut me off in traffic or when they steal my possessions? And judge yourself with that same standard. Or, what would I be like if I were never told no from the day I was born? Or, what would the world look like if it were filled with people exactly like me? That should be enough to convince most people. So, everyone answers yes to condition 1, meaning that they must accept 3 implications that necessarily come from it. Implication number 1 is that there is a morally perfect standard that one falls short of. This is implied, and we will call this standard S, since at this point we don't know what it is. Implication number 2 is that S can only be God, referring to a theistic God like Allah or Yahweh. Implication number 3 is that we are morally accountable to that God. This means that God is both our moral standard and our judge. As we will see, one must accept that if they meet condition 1. At this point, I will address some various failed solutions on man's part, or attempts on man's part to solve the problem of sin. I will then pivot to what the only available solution is, at least among those that would actually work, which is the Christian gospel. In summary, I aim to show that the Christian gospel is the only available solution to sin. Put simply, we don't need the Bible to convince us that we need the gospel. Our need for a Savior is written on our hearts. It is intuitive. One might even call it self-evident. Allow me to emphasize a very important point. This argument is entirely based on what one already thinks about themselves, which decreases the number of truth claims that I must make. So I do not have to show which moral values comprise the moral standard S. All that matters is that one believes that they have fallen short of S. Resultingly, I do not have to define what sin is. All that matters is that one has sinned in their opinion of themselves, not my opinion. And I do not have to prove that God exists. All that matters is that he exists in their mind as their moral standard, a point that I will demonstrate. I do not have to say which, if any God, is S. All that matters is that S is God, generally speaking. And I do not have to say what the punishment for sin is. All that matters is that my viewer believes there is a punishment. So, I make very few truth claims. In fact, this argument would apply to a cannibal who lives on a remote island whose moral values and idea of sin might be very different from ours. And maybe they believe in a God we have never heard of who treats his enemies very differently from the traditional view. Even then, my argument would apply. if we start with the concept of sin as subjectively defined by my viewer, then the gospel is their only hope, regardless of their morals, their religion or lack thereof, or their beliefs about the afterlife. If one is skeptical or hostile to Christianity, I hope that this video changes their perspective. I hope that they begin to see the gospel not as their enemy, but as their only hope. Of course, that does not make it true, but it does change one's perspective. So, implication number 1 is that a moral standard exists. That is, if one meets condition 1 and says that they are morally imperfect, by what standard would they say that they are imperfect? C.S. Lewis says that the moment we say that a line is crooked, we must have in our minds a straight line by which to say that. As stated, we will call this straight line S because it is the standard. For example, if someone robs a bank and we say that it is wrong, we must presuppose a morally perfect S by which to say that that is wrong. In this case, S would not rob banks. Likewise, if the cannibal, who arguably has a very different set of morals than we do, does not live up to those morals like he thinks he should, then he has sinned too, having fallen short of his cannibalistic S. For my argument does not depend on which morals one has. So, just as we would use a ruler to measure distance, we use S to measure our moral behavior. And we can know a few things about S by the fact that it is the standard. For example, we know that S is uncaused, meaning that it is self-sufficient. It does not need to be brought into existence by anything. Why? Because S is the ultimate source of our moral values. If S were caused, then everything about it would have been received from whatever caused it, including those moral qualities that make it S. But that would not make the cause of S the standard, or that would make the cause of S the standard, not S, which is impossible. So, for S to be the ultimate standard, or the ultimate anything for that matter, it cannot be caused. We also know that X has morally perfect character. That has two parts, morally perfect and character. Firstly, we know that S is morally perfect. If this were not the case, if S were morally imperfect, then by what standard would we say that? For we would presuppose a morally perfect standard by which to say that S is morally imperfect, and we would ultimately be judged by that standard, not S. But we already said that S is the standard, meaning that S must be morally perfect. As it is, S cannot be judged any more than one can measure a ruler or weigh a scale. So S is morally perfect. We know that this moral perfection comes from its character. That is, moral perfection is a property that is intrinsic to S. Just as a rock is hard or water is wet, S is morally perfect. I know this because simply calling S the standard implies that it is good in and of itself. Another line of reasoning for this states that the only way for S to be the source of our morality without creating it is if the morality comes from its character. For we know that S did not randomly make up morality one day. Such morality would be arbitrary and not binding. And yet, we know that S is morality's source. The only way this can be is if the morality comes from its character. So, S does not produce morality any more than a rock produces its hardness or water its wetness. Moral perfection is in its character. It is who S is. And up to this point, I have talked about S as an abstract entity, neither living nor non-living. But I think we can deduce that S is living. I will give 4 reasons for this. Firstly, S needs to be living to be the source of morality. That is, we don't go up to rocks or sticks and say, I'm getting my morality from you. Morality is a trait that is unique to living things. Moral values come from a moral being. Secondly, the fact that we praise S in the moral sense, the fact that we call S good or morally perfect indicates that it is not only the source of our morality, but that we recognize it as such. Now, when is the last time you congratulated a rock for its astounding courage in the face of danger? Or when have you praised a stick for its heartfelt commitment to the needs of others? Hopefully never, because we make moral judgments only with reference to living things. Likewise, when we call S good, we imply that it is living. Thirdly, morality is a rational enterprise, meaning that we interpret what is right and wrong through our intellects, our rationales. For example, when we see a gross injustice happening, we don't just have an intuition that it is wrong. We consciously think about it and say, that is wrong. So we apply the morality that is intuitive to us through our rationale. Likewise, S can only apply its morality to us so as to give us the morals we have if it has a rationale. And if S is a rational being, then it is alive like us. Fourthly, morality entails obligation. In other words, there must be something that convinces us to not only say that S is the source of morality, but that we should obey S too. It is difficult to explain how a non-sentient entity like a moral law could be the source of this. In other words, why should I obey a moral law if that is all that it is? Perhaps a skeptic could say that S being intrinsically good is a reason in and of itself to obey it, or that our reason for obeying S is separate from S. But even with this, aren't we usually obedient to living things? I would encourage a skeptic to find another example where we feel morally obligated to obey something that is not sentient, that doesn't have some level of authority to enforce its standard. All this is to say that S is not some jelly blob out in space or merely some inert abstract law, as some modern-day skeptics would say. S is alive. At this point, we know that S, our standard of morality by which we are conscious of our sin, is uncaused, has morally perfect character, and is alive. Or, put differently, S is a necessary, perfect, transcendent being that is the uncaused cause of morality. That is what we call God. S is a theistic God beyond a reasonable doubt. And remember, by God, I only mean capital G God, referring to a theistic God and not any God in particular. For this reason, this argument works for the cannibal, too. Of course, their theistic God would look very different from ours, but it works. In any case, if one believes that they have sinned, they must believe that God's morally perfect character is the moral standard against which their sin is exposed. But let me give some additional attributes that cement this conclusion in place. If S is uncaused, then it can also have no beginning, for everything with a beginning also needs a cause. That is, we don't see things popping into existence with no explanation. Things with beginning always need causes, meaning that if S has no cause, then it can have no beginning. We are reasonably certain through scientific evidence that the universe had a beginning through the Big Bang. So if S has no beginning, then it cannot be part of the universe. Now certainly S could manifest itself in the universe, as seen by the fact that we have a moral standard, but its moral qualities transcend the universe. And we know that the universe, by definition, contains all the matter that there is. So if S is not part of the universe, then it cannot be made of matter, making it immaterial. If S is not made of matter, then it cannot be bound by the laws that determine how matter behaves. So S is supernatural. This does not mean that S behaves irrationally or against nature, simply that the essence of who it is exists in a realm outside of nature. And I say essence because we only know S through the moral law it has given us. Since it is moral traits we are talking about, and not more superficial things like the amount of power or what it looks like, we would say that we know the very essence of who S is through morality. And this exists beyond nature, lest it be material. Moving on, it is reasonable to say that S is sovereign, and I put an asterisk by this because we only know this in the realm of morality. That is, S is the standard to which we hold ourselves accountable, meaning that we give it authority in our lives. So, even if S is not actually sovereign, we make it sovereign by calling it our standard. And we know from the fact that S is morally perfect that we use it to see our sin, that we are not S. We could add that S is personal, meaning that it can be known by us, for we know it through the morality that it sources. Then we have what I call attributes of admission. These are attributes that I cannot definitively prove, but are likely something the sinner already believes in, so I do not have to prove them. The first is that S is absolute, meaning that it cannot change, morally speaking. Now, I cannot prove this, but the chances are that you already believe this. When one says, I have sinned, it is implied that the standard by which to say that does not and cannot change, lest the sin we see by using it become right someday. That is, we need an unchanging standard by which to call our sin, sin. If S is absolute, then it is rational. I do not mean this in the sense of rational used earlier. Here it means that S can make no contradictions, because for S to contradict itself would necessitate change, which is impossible since S is absolute. And from the fact that S is alive, it seems reasonable that it has a will, meaning it wants some things, namely behavior that aligns with what is morally good, meaning its character. And if S is morally perfect, then it must be morally responsible, meaning it is deserving of praise for its character. We admit this when we recognize it as being morally perfect. In summary, S is the ultimate standard that exposes our sin. In order for it to be that standard, it must be uncaused, have morally perfect character, and be alive. That is what we call God. In addition, it must have no beginning, not be a part of the universe, be immaterial, and therefore supernatural. And it is sovereign, at least in the area of morality, and effectively, though not necessarily, S is absolute, rational, willful, and is morally responsible. This is further evidence that S, our moral standard, is God. Now one can call God anything they want. It is popular now among skeptics to call S a groundless moral fact, or a brute truth. In other words, our moral values simply are and need no explanation like God. But simply calling S by a different name does not change who it must be, the necessary, transcendent being we call God. As it is, the theist and most atheists nowadays acknowledge the existence of S. Only theists, however, call S what it must be, God. So I agree with the skeptic in that there are brute moral facts that need no explanation. The only difference is that I call those brute moral facts God because of its necessary attributes. The skeptic tends to think that the non-sentient moral laws need no explanation, that their truth is as intuitive as 2 + 2 = 4. There is no explanation, it just is. This view is called non-theistic moral realism, which means that our moral values are quite real and objective. They don't just exist in our own mind, but they are non-theistic, meaning one doesn't need a theistic God to explain them. But I disagree. Besides the necessary attributes of S, laws need a lawgiver. Why shouldn't we ask why 2 + 2 = 4, given that it is 4 every time? In any other case, if a consistent pattern was generated, we would seek an explanation. We would say that there is a mind behind it. Like if I had a number generator that was supposed to generate random numbers, but instead it generated a 2 every time, I would say that a mind programmed it that way. Why are laws any different? As it is, laws cannot explain themselves. All they do is explain how things work, but not why. For example, the laws of mathematics explain that 2 + 2 always equals 4, but not why 2 + 2 = 4. Likewise, the moral law that the skeptic thinks is self-existent explains that some things are right or wrong, but not why. To answer the why, one needs a lawgiver, a mind. Another problem with non-theistic moral realism is practical in nature. What do we do when there is a disagreement? The non-theistic moral realist will often give a vivid picture that evokes one's emotions, such as a Jew being tortured in a Nazi concentration camp, and they will say, "We don't need God's stamp of disapproval to know that is wrong. Its evil nature is obvious." Well, it may be obvious to them, but how about to the Nazi who was indoctrinated from a young age to hate Jews? So, presumably, there would be a moral disagreement. How would we decide who is right? The non-theistic moral realist usually appeals to their intuition. But who is to say that the Nazi's intuition doesn't tell him differently, based on his actions? If the skeptic appeals to the emotional revulsion they get from the experience, who is to say that the Nazi isn't gaining pleasure through it? If the skeptic appeals to their conscience, who is to say that the Nazi's conscience isn't warped, having grown callous to the suffering of others, and instead producing a moral obligation to serve the Third Reich, as many fascists feel toward their government? So the skeptic usually lacks an objective way in which to interpret which moral principles are right and which are wrong. A robust theory would include this. Contrast this with other S's, like Yahweh or Allah, that give a text like the Bible or the Quran to decide between disagreements. I realize there is much debate even among these, but certainly it is better than basing one's life decisions off their feelings or intuition. But let me address what is perhaps the most popular justification for the skeptic's position, called the Euthyphro dilemma. which comes from one of Plato's works. It asks, from where did God get his morality? For the skeptic thinks that either God got his morality from somewhere else, which would mean that moral principles can exist independently of God, or that God created morality, which would make it arbitrary and not binding. Before I answer that, know that this is a complete distraction, a red herring in the realm of logic, because we don't have to know how God is the source of morality to know that he is the source. So this is a distraction. It sounds to me like the skeptic has more of a problem with God's uncaused nature than with him being S. As it is, the Euthyphro dilemma is a false dilemma, for it does not mention the third option that we just posited, that God neither gets his moral qualities from elsewhere nor makes it up. They come from God's character, from who he is. When I posit this third option, the skeptic will often insist that God's character needs an explanation or a reason, and thereby falls prey to the Euthyphro dilemma. That is, either God got his character from somewhere else, or he made it up someday. But this does not make sense. Character, by definition, is intrinsic to what one is, so it is not gotten from somewhere else, and it is not made up any more than water makes up its wetness. Besides, the skeptic who believes in abstract moral principles, or the non-theistic moral realist, as they are called, believes that it is in the character of these principles to be morally good. So the principles aren't founded on anything else, and they did not suddenly become good one day. They are self-existent and are intrinsically good. But when the theist says that the same thing is true of God's character, they object. So the Euthyphro dilemma, if it is used by a non-theistic moral realist, is guilty of special pleading, meaning it uses a double standard. Why the skeptic is willing to attribute these things to abstract moral principles, but not to an infinite, uncaused being like God, does not make sense to me. And up to this point, I have been differentiating between theories that posit a necessary, uncaused entity as S, but that is not always the case. Some say that morality arose naturally, meaning it is contingent or dependent on something else. Most of these theories basically say the societies that don't rape, pillage, and steal from each other tend to last a little longer than the ones that do, right? So morality arose because of its practical benefits and not because of any intrinsic value that it has. Likewise, the evolutionists would say that morality is an adaptation that helped the human species survive. In these theories, morality is completely neutral. There is no S, no transcendent necessary source of morality. Morality as we know it is just an illusion designed to help us survive. Now, very few evolutionists or naturalists actually believe this, for in that view, loving others is no more right than genocide, and stealing is no more wrong than earning honest wages. Morality as we know it is literally an illusion, just a means to an end. We are, as Jack London put it in his novel The Sea Wolf, just yeasts fighting for survival in an amoral world. Because of this unsavory implication, it is usually proposed that benefiting the species or promoting one's own survival is a moral good in and of itself. That way, there's some purpose behind morality, a higher cause. And who proposes this? Inevitably, it is man. So, man ends up being S in these theories, because he gets to say what is right and what is wrong. But there are some problems with that. The first is that the proponents of these theories contradict themselves, for they are appealing to a transcendent, necessary, uncaused standard like benefiting the species that in their theories cannot exist. In an attempt to derive morality naturally, they appeal to a supernatural realm. The second is that man is simply not qualified to be S. He lacks the attributes. He is not uncaused. He has a beginning, regardless of who we ask. This means that whatever morality he came up with was not always so. In other words, before man existed, it would have been morally permissible to do the things that now decrease his chances of survival, like rape, pillage, and steal. And man is not morally perfect, regardless of who we ask. For the prevalence of wars, genocides, rapes, murders, and sex slavery contradicts the idea that man is the source of values that are more Judeo-Christian in nature. On the other hand, the prevalence of things like charities, kind acts of service, and welfare programs contradict the idea that man is a source of values that are opposite to those of the Judeo-Christian ones. So, from the sinner's perspective, the fact that man is capable of both good and evil means that he is not morally perfect in any way, regardless of which morals one thinks are perfect. So man lacks the attributes to be S, but even if we accept that he is able to be S, the type of morality that he supposedly invents as S is very different from the morality that we have, making him an unlikely source. The first difference is that we tend to think of our moral values as being justified, but man-made systems of morality cannot justify their morality. For how do we know that surviving as a society or reproducing as a species is morally good? How do we know that the moral principles we adhere to today are actually correct and weren't just selected for their survival value? This is especially the case if the person promoting it believes in evolution. Why should I, from an evolutionary perspective, favor the survival of Homo sapiens over gnats or leeches if we all evolved from the same soup? And I can ask questions like these because the natural theories because they claim to be natural. That is, they cannot say, well, the survival of the species is intrinsically good and needs no explanation, because that would be appealing to an abstract moral principle like X or S that in their worldview cannot exist. This is related to the is to ought problem in ethics. Natural theories can only explain how certain behaviors work and the practical benefits they have, but not why we ought to do them. To explain why, they inevitably appeal to an uncaused, transcendent, necessary S that in their worldview cannot exist. As it is, atheists and theists alike appeal to S, which can only be God. If the naturalist attempts to stay true to their naturalism and says that there is literally no moral obligation to do anything, all that matters is what helps us survive, then they deny that they met condition 1, which implied that there was in fact a moral standard that they fell short of. Moving on, the next difference is that the man-made systems severely devalue morality. For morality is almost always treated as a means to an end, a way to help us survive, not something that is inherently valuable. Nothing is just right or just wrong, it just depends on what seems to help man survive. But implied in this is that if we no longer needed morality to survive, that we could get rid of it, something the naturalist is probably unwilling to consider. On the other hand, saying that an uncaused, morally perfect being like God forms the basis for morality, and that such morality is neither created nor gotten from elsewhere, but comes from his character, allows morality to be intrinsically good. Thirdly, man-made morality removes the basis for altruism, which is a genuine concern for others. It is possible to ascribe to one of these theories and be genuinely concerned for others. However, they provide no basis for doing so, because ultimately in these theories, the reason for concern for others is concern for self, one's own survival. There is no way around this. The moment one becomes genuinely concerned for others, they are forgetting the very reason they are doing that, which is self. The only way around this is to say that one has acted altruistically in ignorance, not knowing why they did so. But the skeptic, since they do know, cannot claim this. On the other hand, S's, like the Christian deity, are intrinsically loving, so the morality they source is not just a means to the end of serving oneself. Fourthly, man-made morality usually does not value one's motives, but we know better. If I work at a soup kitchen in order to boost my resume for a job application, we say that that is not right despite being outwardly beneficial. But according to most man-made systems, what benefits the species or the society is morally right, regardless of the motive. Theistic explanations do not suffer from this problem, for their deity usually takes motives into account. Because the natural systems treat morality as nothing more than a means to an end, they break down in practice. This is the fifth difference. The morals in them tend to change. And maybe this is because they fail to provide a robust method for applying the moral principles like Christianity does. But these theories basically say, I will treat others nicely, but only as a means to my own good. But what happens when we decide that we can skip treating others nicely, that it is unnecessary to achieve what we really want, our own good? Well, we would serve our own good all right, but this time it would be at the expense of others. If one thinks that this is purely theoretical and will never happen, then look at what happened when the Nazis got it in their head to serve the Aryan race at the expense of being nice to the Jews. They were doing what the secular theorist tells us all to do, to serve our own good. The only difference is that they cut out what they thought was the unnecessary step of being nice to the Jews. In fact, If one had the ability to wipe out everyone on the planet so they could loot their possessions and live the rest of their life in luxury, these secular theories would tell them, go ahead, because they're acting for their own good and do not need to treat others nicely in order to do so. If they're able to omit the unnecessary step, then by all means do so. If they have a chance to attain what they're really after, then do not let the opportunity pass. If the natural theorist is unwilling to consider this, then they show that they really believe in S, which can only be God. Some naturalists will insist that these situations can never occur, that what is altruistic and what is considerate of others will always benefit the species. Perhaps they would argue that the person who nukes the world and loots its riches would not truly be happy and would therefore never do it. Firstly, history does not corroborate this. Generally speaking, when the moral standard of God is replaced with one of our own making, things don't end well. The people that promote this tend to either forget history or never knew it to begin with. But even if these situations were purely theoretical, that would be enough to reject them. Imagine that you're reading the laws of a certain country, and they say something to the effect of, be nice to others and treat them kindly. And you think, well, that's great, until you notice that in fine print they write, if you can skip being nice to others and nuke them and plunder their riches instead, that is okay. So, angrily, you go to the legislators that wrote this law, and they tell you, oh, don't you worry, that's just a theoretical possibility. It won't actually ever happen. Would that appease you? No, because the fact that a system of morality allows for such things, even if it is only in theory, is its condemnation. And so it is with the man-made systems of morality. They allow for literally anything that benefits the species and only as a way to benefit oneself. Theistic explanations do not suffer from this, for their morals are grounded in the unchanging character of their deity. Since God is a necessary being, his character cannot change or be different even in theory. And since he is uncaused, his character is not dependent on anything else that could potentially change. This provides a stable, unchanging basis for morality that the natural theories cannot provide. And I would like to point out that man has a huge conflict of interest when he attempts to invent the standard that he is judged by. No defendant being tried for robbery would get to make the rules that define whether robbery is right or wrong, for they have a conflict of interest. They would inevitably lower the standard of morality so they get off easy. And the same is true of man-made systems. Do you think that man would ever invent a standard that condemns his own behavior? Of course not. So is it a coincidence that their systems replace genuine altruism and compassion with, you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours? No, for that moral code is far easier to follow. Man gets off easy. Conversely, the fact that you, the listener, met condition 1 and are judged by the standard is further evidence that you or someone like you did not invent it. So in summary, implication number 2 is that S, our moral standard, can only be God, meaning a theistic deity. We saw this through its necessary attributes. This creates problems for theories that say that God is unnecessary for morality. This includes the types of non-theistic moral realism, which appeal to abstract moral principles, and the naturalistic theories, which appeal to the practical benefits of morality. But just to be sure, I gave about 6 additional reasons for why S cannot be man. As it is, S can only be God, whose righteous character is the basis for morality. Now that we know that the sinner in condition 1 is exposed by the righteous character of God in implication number 2, let us dive into implication number 3. But before we do, I have one last question for you to consider. It's really been bothering me lately. I just can't seem to answer it, so maybe you can help. So here it is. How does a tree count backwards if it has to go to the post office for a colonoscopy? Again, how does a tree count backwards if it has to go to the post office for a colonoscopy? If you can answer that for me, I would be in your debt. And there is further benefit to doing so, for trees getting colonoscopies is highly relevant to our discussion on morality, obviously. But anyways, bizarre humor aside, let's go back to our implications. Implication number 3 is that we are morally accountable to God, meaning that he is our judge. So God is both standard and judge. I say morally accountable because this is how we act. Unless you have a system of morality that does not punish sin, that lets wrongdoers get off the hook, then we live and act as if we are morally accountable to something. How do I know that that something is God? Well, from a bird's eye view, we know that God is uncaused, supernatural, immaterial, sovereign, morally perfect, and rational, among other things. I am curious, what other being would one propose as judge, if not him? He seems like the natural choice. Besides, let me give an analogy. When a criminal is condemned in court, what are they accountable to? The judge or the law that the judge uses? I think the law. Though the judge applies the law, the criminal isn't ultimately answering to the judge. He answers to the law that both him and the judge are under. The judge merely applies the law, but is himself not the law. So the law is what we answer to. Now we know that the ultimate law, the ultimate standard, is not some abstract idea that someone else needs to apply. Our ultimate standard is a being, God. This means that we answer to him. So although this argument is not bulletproof, I think it is still reasonable to say that God is both our standard and judge. Now this will trigger some objections. One might say, isn't it biased for God to craft the standard from himself? Some might even call it narcissistic, saying it is a sign of self-obsession to demand that everyone act like themselves. And to be clear, God does not craft the moral standard. He is the moral standard. He does not invent morality any more than a rock invents its hardness or a water its wetness. But let me directly answer the objection. Since the objector does not directly target my argument, instead targeting how God is the standard rather than the fact that he is the standard, I will assume its truth. God is both our moral standard and our judge, meaning that to question his motives in judging is also to question his role as moral standard. But we cannot do that, for we already showed that only God can be our standard. Questioning one standard in morality is like sawing off the branch that they are sitting on. It undermines their own foundation. But let us ignore this problem and pretend that this objection can get off the ground. If we were able to question God, we would be unquestioningly submitting to whatever standard we judge God by. And I could just as easily question that standard, saying, why are you being so narcissistic, imposing what you want on God? Because once they reject God, the objector usually ends up being their own standard. So at the end of the day, we just have to submit to a moral standard which only God has the qualifications to be. But one might press the objection, saying, but didn't you just get done saying that one of the problems with man-made morality is that man bases a standard off what he wants, and that doing so presents a tremendous conflict of interest? And yet, you say that God bases his own moral standard off what he wants. God obviously has a conflict of interest. Well, besides the problem of morally undermining itself, accusing God of having a conflict of interest implies that he is somehow imposing his standard in order to benefit himself. And in the case of the Christian God, he does receive glory through this, but equally as true is the fact that his nature is to be loving. 1 John says that God is love, and this means having a genuine concern for others. So to say that he has a conflict of interest by imposing that standard on us is ridiculous. It is not a standard that he could possibly benefit from unless he followed it, which would remove the basis for accusing him. But one might object, saying, well, if God is our standard, then that means he is not morally accountable to anyone. So God could do anything, like torture babies and stuff, and we wouldn't know any different because he is the standard. But in this case, whatever it is that we hold God accountable to would be the standard, not God. Since God is the standard, he cannot be held accountable. The standard accountable is no standard at all, for the standard is, by definition, what we hold others accountable to and cannot itself be held accountable. To say, let's judge God our moral standard would be like saying, let's measure a ruler or let's weigh a scale. We don't grade God, for God himself is the rubric by which we grade. Since he is the standard, then what he does is, by definition, good. But one might object, saying, well, there are other things that God has done that I don't like and would disqualify him from being the standard. But remember, I am not saying which God is the standard. I am only saying that it needs to be a theistic God, such as Allah or Yahweh. But it is certainly not limited to these. So when combined, implications 1 through 3 yield the following statement. We are morally accountable to a holy God for our sin. We determine that we have sin and the holiness of the standard by which we say that we have sin in implication number 1. We determined that that standard is God in implication number 2, and we determined our moral accountability in implication number 3. So God is both standard and judge, and we have fallen short. What are we going to do? People have made numerous attempts to solve their sin once they are confronted with it, but all they do is deny that we have a problem. In other words, our knee-jerk reaction to being asked if we are morally perfect is to say, of course not. But then when we are asked how we intend to solve that problem, we pose solutions that effectively deny our sin. The first set of these so-called solutions is to make excuses. When we make excuses, we are implying that our behavior was not really wrong, that it was justified because of X, Y, or Z reasons. For example, one might say that they are genetically predisposed to certain behaviors. This implies that their choice was not free, that it was determined beforehand by their genetic makeup. This denies condition 1 because if they could not have chosen otherwise, if nature made them do it, then one could not be held morally responsible for their actions. This quote-unquote evil behavior would not be any worse than a lion killing a gazelle for food, or a bacterium infecting a body, or a magnet exerting a magnetic force. Nature, at least in part, made me do it. If this solution seems to be nerdy or just for the academic elite, you may have heard it through things like, I'm a redhead, that gives me a hot temper, or both my parents were alcoholics and are prone to addictive behaviors, or I have an addictive personality. But what do these imply? By making excuses for sin, these imply that we are not responsible, something that was contradicted when they agreed with condition 1. So, sin comes from us, not nature. So some blame their sin on nature, others blame it on nurture, saying the way they were raised, meaning the way they were raised. They might say, well, it's just the way I was raised, or it's what I've always been brought up to believe, or I didn't know any better. But remember, although our circumstances influence our actions, ultimately the sin comes from us, not our circumstances. This was implied in condition 1. Yet others might attempt to deny sin completely. I have heard it said something like, you must create the sickness to sell the cure. In other words, you have to make it look like there is a big problem that needs fixing in order to sell a cure for it. But this implies that there is not actually a problem. It either denies outright or downgrades the fact that one has sinned. Would you agree that standing before a holy God with sin in your life is a problem? If one doesn't see that as a problem, as something that needs a cure, then they have denied condition 1 and contradict themselves. So, blaming the problem on something else, whether it be on their genes, their circumstances, or the people, or the one who is pointing it out, does not fix the problem of sin. And let me speak to the heart here. Exactly whose sin do we want to justify? Is it ever the sins of others? When someone cuts us off in traffic or steals our personal items, do we start making a list of excuses to justify their behavior? Of course not. They are in the wrong, and my sacred excuses are for me and me alone. And that is human nature. When our hearts are set on sin, we will find a way to justify it no matter how heinous it is, even when we would condemn that same behavior in others. There have also been attempts to solve the problem of sin by denying our first implication, which is that a moral standard exists. This denies implication number 1 because if no objective standard exists, then one cannot charge anyone with sin, including the objector. It seems that the most popular way to do this in our present culture is through moral relativism, which is the idea that no objective morality exists. Morality is just a construct, meaning that ultimately morality is just up to you and me. And one might use this to say something like, well, what I did wasn't actually wrong. It was just my opinion, or society's opinion of what was wrong at the time. Or, my licentious behavior is not wrong, it just contradicts the societally derived norms of my grandparents. But the relativists knew they had sin when they met condition 1. They then conveniently deny that by saying there is no objective standard. The reason they meet condition 1 is because they live as if objective morals do exist despite denying them with their words, a point I defend in my video series on the topic. Suffice it to say what C.S. Lewis said, everyone is a relativist until someone takes their seat on the bus. As it is, the relativist by denying that there is no objective standard, denies the absolute, unchanging nature of S, which is logically necessary. Others might effectively deny the existence of S through a belief in moral skepticism. A moral skeptic believes that there is objective moral truth, but that limitations in human understanding and error makes it impossible for us to know what that truth is. And you will hear this through statements like, "There are so many different world religions. How could I know that any one of them is correct?" Or, "How can you claim that your way is the right way when so many others have claimed that and been mistaken?" So, the moral skeptic believes there is objective moral truth, but denies their ability to know it. Effectively, it's saying, "I didn't know any better." But the skeptic knew better when they met condition 1, or they would not have charged themselves with sin. Once again, this is nothing more than an intellectual excuse. As it is, the skeptic tends to deny the knowability of S, which is logically necessary. And, like the relativist, the skeptic is able to meet condition 1 because they live as if they know what morality is. Particularly, the skeptic tends to feel the moral obligation to question any kind of moral truth claim on pain of being exclusive and intolerant. Yet others would say that guilt is merely a survival mechanism, that it evolved in order to protect people from behavior that was harmful to themselves. So, over time, those with an inability to feel guilt or remorse for what they have done end up hurting themselves and others, thus decreasing their chance of survival. That left us with an entire species that can feel guilt. If this is true, then our quote-unquote sin is not morally wrong. It is just bad for our survival. All guilt does is show us that we're doing something that is detrimental to us, not that we're doing something wrong. But that's not what our objector thought when they met condition 1. They agreed that they sinned, that they didn't just fail to increase their odds of survival. Besides, by their own logic, if guilt helps us survive by convincing us that the things we do are actually wrong, then wouldn't their knowledge that guilt is merely a survival mechanism decrease their chances of survival? Wouldn't we start doing those behaviors that would otherwise make us guilty, knowing that they are not actually wrong? And wouldn't we thereby endanger ourselves by the objector's logic, not mine? So, the objector should go back to being ignorant of where guilt came from for the sake of their own fitness. If they object to this, saying that it is intellectually dishonest to be willfully ignorant of the origin of guilt, I would ask, what dishonesty? Because under their view, honesty and dishonesty, as we call it, are equally as virtuous if they help the species survive. Others might object, saying that we have evolved to the point of not needing morality anymore. Morality helped us survive when we were Neanderthals, but now we are a superior race, and it's now time to create the ultimate utopia. Now that is scary. History demonstrates that every time man gets that idea in his head, bad things happen, like genocides and purgings. So we are clearly not ready to throw away the crutch of morality, even from the naturalist's perspective. As it is, the evolutionist denies the uncaused nature of S, saying instead that it is instead dependent on our survival. But we know that S is necessarily uncaused, or it would not be ultimate. That was implication number 2. So these so-called solutions do not solve the problem of sin. All they do is pretend that no ultimate standard exists to judge sin by, which contradicts implication number 1. Next on our list of failed solutions are solutions that do nothing more than deny implication number 2, which was that God is S, by seeking to replace him with a different standard. But we showed that only God can be the standard. So by denying him, they deny the only possible standard by which sin is defined, leaving us with no sin at all. Of course, that contradicts condition 1. For example, some replace God with the conduct of others. You will hear things like, "Well, I'm no Hitler. I haven't murdered anyone. I mean, what do you expect from me, some Mother Teresa?" As if the standard by which we were judged is Hitler's conduct. As it is, S is God's righteous character, not the conduct of others. To see how silly this reasoning is, imagine a robber sitting in a courtroom and he listens to the judge decree that the particular robbery they committed deserves 5 years in prison. Would they sit there and make up their own rule book where they get off easy, thinking that that would save them from prison? No, because the only standard that matters is the one that the judge is using. What the robber wants is entirely irrelevant. And yet, That is what we do when we who are guilty attempt to supplant God with a moral standard of our own. Another example of this foolish reasoning is when we replace God with the conduct of self. You will hear it said, well, everyone has some flaws. Take it easy, Mr. Theist. But what are they implying? That it is okay to have moral flaws. As long as they are good enough in their own eyes, then apparently that should be good enough for God. But as his God, not the conduct of self, and not the opinions of oneself either. Or some say, do enough good works, and you will be okay. These people imagine some kind of cosmic scale where all their bad works are on one side and all their good works are on another, and if their good works outweigh their bad works, then they will be fine. If one believes this, I want them to be truly honest with themselves. Have their good works truly outweighed their bad ones? And are the ones that are externally good motivated that way internally? For sinful motives tend to be present no matter what we are doing. Sin is more than an isolated action. It is a heart condition, and one doesn't have to be religious to see that. I ask these questions because we have a tendency to overestimate ourselves. The majority of people think they are better than average. Besides, imagine that our robber is sitting in court and, upon hearing his sentence, tells the judge about how many good things he has done and how they outweigh his robbery. Yeah, Judge, I robbed this bank, but look at all the good stuff I've done. Look at all the banks I didn't rob. You should let me go. Should the judge let him go? No, for that would be unjust. It leaves sin unpunished, and yet that is what we do when we attempt to erase our sin with good deeds. In fact, if the judge were wise, and I suspect that God is very wise, they would see through to the selfish motives of such a robber, knowing that their reason for doing these quote-unquote good deeds is for themselves to cleanse their guilty conscience, not because they genuinely wanted to do them. As it is, good moral conduct is expected. That's what we're supposed to do. It doesn't warrant some kind of special reward. Jesus said something similar in Luke 17, verse 10. Sin, on the other hand, even from a non-biblical perspective, deserves punishment, which no amount of good deeds can erase. So replacing God, our moral standard, with our own conduct doesn't fix our sin. What about replacing him with our intentions? This is very common, and you will hear things like, well, as long as you're well-intended, you'll be okay. Or, you just need to follow your heart. Or, as long as you are sincere about what you believe, you will be fine in the end. Once again, the standard by which we are judged is God's righteous character, not our intentions. This is yet another way to deny condition 1, swap out the standard with one that justifies us so that we have no sin. Besides, just because one is sincere does not make them right. C.S. Lewis says that the drunk person is well-intended when they choose to take another drink, but only because they are too intoxicated to know not to. But does that make their decision innocent? No, for they made the decision to keep drinking while they still had the capacity to say no. So it is not enough to say that one has good intentions or that they are sincere. We could add that the terrorists in 9/11 were sincere in what they believed, but obviously no one would, or not many of us would say that what they did was right. And the Bible speaks of this as well. In Genesis 3, when Eve took the fruit from the tree that she was forbidden to eat from, it says that she saw the fruit as pleasing to the eyes and good for wisdom. So Eve was well-intended. She was doing what she thought was both satisfying and wise, but this was only because she first rejected God's standard, replacing it with one of her own that would allow her evil actions. Then, all of a sudden, sin just seemed like the right thing to do. So, sin becomes right in our eyes, and we become well-intended, so to speak, but only because we rejected God first. So, changing the standard by which we are judged does not fix sin. Our imaginary objector has attempted to deny condition 1 both directly and by denying its first 2 implications. What if they tried to deny implication 3? Well, implication number 3 is that we are morally accountable to God. This means that God is not only our standard, he is also our judge. All of the following so-called solutions will deny that God will hold us morally accountable because of a certain attribute of his. Some might say that if God is great, that he can just forgive us for our sin, but if one is going to say that God forgives someone, they need to give a mechanism for how he is able to do that. They can't just vaguely appeal to his greatness and leave it at that. Like I couldn't say, well, God can make a logical contradiction because he's great, or because God is great, he can act in a sinful manner. As it is, a God who is truly great is just, meaning he punishes sin when he sees it. A God who just forgives is unjust, and this is using a generic definition of just, meaning the punishing of wrongdoing. As it is, this failed solution attempts to deny that it is God's holy and righteous character that we are judged by, thus changing the standard. Some will appeal to God's omniscience or his knowledge and say that because he knows we are fallible humans, that we are just dust, that he will be more understanding of our sin. But it is precisely God's knowledge that should scare us, not comfort us. Besides, does this not change the standard? The standard that God judges us by is his perfect moral character, not something of the sinner's contrivance. Yet others might say, well, if God is loving, then he can just forgive people. The end. A truly loving God won't punish sin. But as stated earlier, a just God must punish sin. He cannot just forgive people with no basis. We remain accountable to him. Besides, forgiveness is never free. If someone steals $100 from me, it costs me precisely $100 to forgive them, for the one who forgives must forfeit the repayment they would have otherwise received. So saying that God can arbitrarily forgive with no further action on his part doesn't make sense. Once again, allow me to speak to the heart behind objections like this. Exactly whose sin do we want God to freely forgive? Again, when someone cuts us off in traffic or does things to us that are far less egregious than what we have done to God, do we appeal to God that he should forgive them? Do we not curse them, pronouncing judgment on them for their horrible offense? So, it seems that free forgiveness is reserved exclusively for self, not others. And do we demand that God freely forgive the Nazis or the serial killers or the pimps? So, human nature has once again found a way to justify one's own behavior and yet condemn the wrong behavior of others. So that marks the end of all the solutions that do nothing more than deny condition 1 or one of its necessary implications. Another major category of failed solutions is devoted to completely ignoring the problem of sin, which of course does not fix the problem, it only lets it fester. And this takes a variety of forms. Some might trust their riches, saying something like, I am rich, I have all that I need. And while we might not say this verbatim, it is implied through our actions. If you put a sign in a busy city square saying, how to fix your sin, how many people do you think would show up? And how many would show up if the sign said, how to double your income overnight? So, people are generally more concerned with making money than fixing their sin. Yet others might trust their prestige. They would say, I am famous, people admire me. So they will spend their lives climbing up the corporate ladder or laboring for the affection of others. But again, what does one's prestige have to do with the moral problem of sin? This is only a distraction. Yet others may trust their family, saying, my family loves me, I am content. Again, this is nothing more than a distraction from sin. It gives the illusion that everything is fine when it isn't, because all these things will pass away when we face our judge for our own actions apart from our families. Will we stand? God, if he is as sovereign as we suggested in implication number 2, could demand one's life this very night, and whose would their possessions be? Jesus says something similar in Luke 12:13-21. Yet others will pursue comfort. They will say, thinking about my sin makes me uncomfortable. As it should. Should a person who is about to commit a robbery say to themselves, well, when I think about the consequences of my actions, like time spent in prison, I feel uncomfortable, so I'm going to continue in my ways and rob this bank? That would be foolish, and yet that is what our objector is doing. If you were this person, what do you love more, being comfortable or the truth? Are you willing to hate your sin, or would you rather live in willful ignorance of it? Once again, allow me to address the heart. Would the objector demand that Hitler not think about his sin because it makes him uncomfortable? If they think that their sin is better than Hitler's and doesn't need attention, what standard are they using to say that? Certainly not God's. They have changed it, a practice that was addressed earlier. Yet others might avoid the issue of sin by saying that guilt is inherently bad. They would say that guilt is pathological, that one just needs to forgive themselves. And this is oftentimes promoted in the field of psychology. But no one believes this. Can you imagine if the robber in the judge's court said, "You made me feel guilty, Mr. Judge, and that's bad, so you know what? I forgave myself, so I shouldn't have to face prison time." Would that one fly? No, because sinners are in no position to forgive themselves. That is for the judge to do. As it is, this failed solution denies implication number 3, saying that we are ultimately accountable to ourselves rather than to God. And allow me to address the heart. When people cut us off on the highway or steal our possessions, do we say, "You should just stop feeling guilty because guilt is bad"? No, only our guilt is what we should feel bad about. And there are many who would not even think of giving others the unmerited grace that they lavish on themselves. And do we think that the Nazis shouldn't feel guilty for what they did? Of course not. The only way one shouldn't feel guilty is if they have done no wrong. So explaining away guilt as pathological effectively denies that there was any wrongdoing to begin with. As it is, guilt is meant to point us to an underlying moral problem. Telling a person to remove their guilt without addressing the underlying problem would be like waking up in the middle of the night to the sound of a smoke detector going off and saying, "That sound drives me nuts, so let me rip it out of the ceiling and go back to sleep." Just as the smoke detector points us to a fire, guilt points us to a moral problem. You say I need to stop feeling guilty. I say that you don't feel guilty enough if, as condition 1 implies, you have sinned against a holy God. And you should let that guilt drive you to a real solution, one that actually fixes a problem. Yet others will procrastinate. They will say, "I will think about these things when I get older." In other words, I love my sin too much to work to try to fix it now, so let me worry about it later. Some even plan their so-called conversion for when they're on their deathbed. But this is completely irresponsible, for how does one know that their deathbed won't arrive sooner than they think? Besides, if one has lived their entire life up until their deathbed living in the sin that they love, refusing to fix a problem, then what makes them think that they will be any different on their deathbed? Will they magically change their attitude towards sin in order to embrace a solution to it if there is one? Of course not. They will have loved their sin too much to fix it. What makes one think that turning from their sin 30 or 40 or 50 years from now, after they have spent that time living in it, will be easier than it is today? The easiest time to change is now. The procrastinator says, "Let me have fun now and I will convert later." Not with that attitude, they won't. A planned conversion is a fake conversion. One can deceive others and even themselves, but they cannot deceive the righteous God to whom they are accountable. This lazy attitude is why some people on their deathbed find it impossible to change their ways. They want to change, but they can't because they have spent their whole lives hardening themselves. So if one wants to fix their sin, they must hate it first, which means fixing it now. And it is very popular now to say to follow oneself. In other words, follow your own heart, do what makes you happy, and we couldn't possibly go wrong with that, right? The problem with this is that the heart is what created this predicament. That's where the sin came from, so why should we trust it? And again, this does not even attempt to fix the problem, it just pushes it under the rug. So all of these solutions do not solve the problem, all they do is ignore it. Some might acknowledge that they have sinned and choose to pay the price. Some might say, "I will deal with my sin later, but right now I just want to have fun." So that flows into the procrastination category mentioned earlier, only in this case they acknowledge that they are accountable for their sin and that they are willing to pay the price. Only they probably don't think the price is very high, or they would be a little bit more desperate to find a solution. Yet others might say, "What I did wasn't that bad, so I'll just pay the price." But isn't that God's call to make? He is the judge, not us. Or if this kind of person believes in an afterlife, they might have some stage of final cleansing where they are punished before they are worthy of entering heaven. And this is plausible. However, how sin is dealt with in those levels would almost always fall into one of the categories addressed earlier, especially doing enough good works to merit God's favor. The faults of this were described earlier. At this point, let's summarize what we have covered so far. Condition 1 is that I have sinned. If a person acknowledges this, then they must also accept 3 implications that, when put together, say that we are morally accountable before a holy God. The fact that we are morally accountable was implication 3, the fact that we are accountable before God was implication 2, and the fact that God is holy is implication 1. And I still mean this in a non-religious sense. That is, God's existence, His holiness, and our moral accountability to Him are all implied when one admits that they have sinned, regardless of how one defines sin or which God they believe in. At this point, one might say, I give up. I have fallen too far. It is pointless, so I had best live out my life as best I can. If this is you, I think that your hunger and thirst for a solution to your sin is evidence of a solution's existence. For just as physical hunger is evidence of food, moral hunger is evidence of a moral solution. Now, hungry people do not always get fed, so this solution is not necessarily available to us. But let us consider what that solution would look like. To put it simply, we know that God is just and needs to punish sin, and we can only hope that He loves us and has attempted to remedy our condition. If this were the case, the only way for God to punish sin without punishing the sinner is to punish a substitute, which we will call S, in the sinner's place. A substitute is the only viable option. No attempt on man's behalf, no comparing oneself to others, no changing or denying the standard, no amount of good works can remedy his condition or make his sin magically disappear. We need a substitute to take our sin away. At this point, I could end the video because Christianity is the only religion to offer a substitute for sin. No other religion does this. The ones that appear to place the means of salvation outside of self don't actually do this, and they do not offer an actual payment for sin. Only Christianity offers a substitute. This substitute is called Jesus Christ in the Bible. 2 Corinthians 5:21 says of Christ, "For our sake He made Him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in Him we might become the righteousness of God." In other words, God treated Jesus as though He were sin itself so that we could be righteous in His eyes. To put it more personally, God treated Jesus as though He had lived our lives so that He could treat us as though we had lived His righteous life. I am not saying that this actually happened, only that it is the only available solution. Please note that I am not commenting on whether a substitute exists or how we might get that substitution to apply to us. I am only saying that a substitute is our only hope. So the skeptic should want the Bible to be true instead of begrudgingly accepting its truth after years of debate. And although I quoted a Bible verse, I do not need the Bible, Judeo-Christian principles, or even theism to be true to come to this conclusion. If one has met condition 1, if they have sinned in their own view, then they are morally accountable to a holy God, for which a substitute is their only hope. Please remember that I did not have to say which moral values we fall short of, what sin is, whether God exists, which God is S, or the degree of punishment for sin. So this argument applies to the atheist who denies that God exists, and even to the cannibal on a remote island, who, theoretically, has different moral values than us. I do not actually think that they have different morals, at least in a basic sense, which I defend in my video series on moral relativism. But I am offering this as a thought experiment to show that even if they had fundamentally different morals, that my argument would still apply to them. So, for example, maybe the cannibal thinks that he is morally obligated to eat other people and not the hamburgers and french fries that those first world savages eat. But our cannibal is plagued by the guilt that one year he ate only one person instead of two. We know that for this cannibal to be aware of his sin, he needs a morally perfect standard that can only be a theistic God to which he is accountable. Obviously, this God would look very different from the one we are used to. So I do not have to presuppose what sin is, what character traits S has, which God is S. That is for the cannibal to decide based on his morals. In fact, I do not even have to say that God exists, for a cannibalistic God exists only in the cannibal's imagination. All that matters is that believing in this God's existence is consistent with what he already believes about his sin. And I do not have to presuppose a degree of punishment so long as the cannibal agrees that he deserves punishment in some sense. Even in this case, the only way for the cannibal to be saved, the only way for his God to punish sin without punishing the sinner, is if his God punished a substitute in his place. And Christianity is the only religion to offer that, making it his only hope. I do have to say, though, that should this substitution happen, that would say something about the God who does it, such as his loving nature. and that would, in effect, disqualify certain deities from being S, like the cannibalistic ones. All right, the skeptic says, you have shown me that the atonement of Christ, even if it happened, is my only hope. But I have some questions about it before we go any further. Now at this point, objecting to the atonement is objecting to one's only hope, so hopefully these objections are made with the goal of making sense of the atonement and not disproving it. Doing otherwise would be like cutting off one's lifeline, very unwise. So the first objection would say that the atonement is abusive. Some have mockingly referred to it as divine child abuse. But this is single-handedly refuted by the idea that the Christian substitute was willing. Jesus said that he lays down his life of his own accord, so God is not abusing his son. Others might say that the atonement is unjust. They would say, why should the blood of the innocent be required for anything? Shouldn't each person pay for his own sin and not someone else? Well, double imputation, which is a process of God giving our sin to Christ and giving Christ's righteousness to us, concerns the consequences of sin, not the sin itself. I think that the objector is right in saying that God cannot transfer sin from one person to another, for sin is a personal choice. Nor can he transfer righteousness from Christ to us, for righteousness, again, is a personal choice that can only be made by the person who displays it. But double imputation involves the transferring of the consequences of sin, not the sin itself, to Christ, and the consequences of his righteousness, not the righteousness itself, to us. So I believe that verses like 2 Corinthians 5:21 that call us the righteousness of God are speaking figuratively. Because we receive the consequences of righteousness, it is as if we actually were his righteousness. And because Christ received the consequences of our sin, he, figuratively speaking, became sin for us. It is also possible that since the Bible refers to sin as more than a personal choice and also as a nature that rules, that allowed God to treat it separately from the sinner who chooses it. I am not sure of this. For now, let's say that Christ becoming sin refers to the consequences of sin, which will suffice for our purposes. Okay, well maybe the atonement is consistent with God's justice, but his forgiveness offered through it isn't. God should punish sin where he sees it and not just be forgiving people. But 1 John 1:9 says, if we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from unrighteousness. So God is described as faithful and yes, just as well for forgiving sin. This is because the legal price that sin deserves has been paid on our behalf. God is not leaving sin unpunished. He either punishes us or he punishes Christ on our behalf, and we get to choose who will bear it. This is why Romans 3:26 says, it was to show his righteousness at the present time, so that he might be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. So, justifying sinners is, through Christ's work, consistent with God's justice. Others might ask about the scope of the atonement, saying, how is it that one man's sacrifice can apply to so many? Because if Christ was a human, then shouldn't his death only be able to apply to one human as opposed to millions? This is a tough question. Some have said that because Christ is God, that he was an infinite being and therefore could bear an infinite punishment, which is the sum total of all the eternal punishment in hell that believers would otherwise receive. Now, I don't see this in the Bible. I'm not saying that it isn't true, just that I don't see that explicitly laid out in Scripture. What I do see in Scripture is easier to explain with an analogy. Let's imagine the Summer Olympics and how each country sends an athlete. This athlete is the best that their country has to offer. If they win, we say that their country won with them. If the athlete loses, the country loses with them, even though it was technically the athlete that did the winning or losing. But the athlete represented their country. They were their country's champion, allowing the entire country to share in their reward. Likewise, the Bible describes Christ as the representative of, the champion of, the human race. We win with him when we have faith in what he did for us, and we lose with Adam when we insist on our own way. Romans 5:19 says, for as by the one man's disobedience the many were made sinners, so by the one man's obedience the many will be made righteous. Paul is referring to Adam's sin and how sin entered the world through his disobedience. Just as death spread to all, even though it was only Adam that sinned, So life spreads to all, even though it was only Christ that lived the perfect life. Christ was the second Adam to represent man like Adam did, and to redeem the human race that Adam caused to fall. Jesus did in the Garden of Gethsemane what Adam couldn't do in the Garden of Eden. Those who have faith in him share in his reward. Those who insist on their own way, like Adam, share in his failure. So, by viewing Jesus as a representative, we don't necessarily have to view the amount of punishment that Jesus bore as being directly related to the number of people he atones for. As the champion of God's people, Jesus competed in the arena of spiritual warfare, winning the battle for us that we could never win on our own. This is not to understate the verses that speak of Christ dying for individuals. He most certainly did that. However, I do think that the Bible speaks of his atonement in both an individual and in a corporate sense, which do not necessarily contradict. Moving on, others would say that forgiveness on God's part shows weakness, a failure to punish sin where he sees it. At this point, this is more of an emotional objection, as the legal workings of the atonement have been described, and however weak it is, we are in desperate need of it. Others might object to justification by faith, saying it is too exclusive. They would say, are you saying that only those who believe in Jesus escape the punishment of their sin, and everyone else goes to hell? What about people who haven't heard the gospel? Well, in the Avengers Endgame movie, in the final battle, Doctor Strange holds up his index finger to Iron Man to let Iron Man know that they are currently executing the only option where the good guys would win out of about 14 million options. Likewise, according to our arguments, there is only one possible way for salvation to happen, and God has executed precisely that. I didn't quite go through 14 million of them, but you get the point. So if the way to salvation seems exclusive, know that we made it that way by choosing to sin, for which there is only one possible solution. And if there is only one possible way, then why are we upset at God for not offering another? And I will address some nuances of what it means to trust in Jesus in a little bit. The next objection is more emotional in nature and says the atonement is insulting. In other words, it is just plain offensive to tell people that they need a savior. And that makes sense, but the offense that one takes is irrelevant to being saved. So if one is ticked off, it's still their only hope. The gospel has always been offensive. That is nothing new. Paul says in Galatians 5:11, "But if I, brothers, still preach circumcision, why am I still being persecuted?" In that case, the offense of the cross has been removed. Paul is referring to those who would say that following the Jewish law, and particularly circumcision, is required to be saved. So they are attempting to add a good work to grace, and he says, if that were the case, then the offense of the cross would be removed, because we would be telling people that they can basically save themselves, that they don't need someone to bail them out. And that's exactly what people want to hear. The last objection is again more emotional in nature and says, I just want control of my life. And you will hear this in more gentle terms when people say, I understand the gospel, but religion just isn't for me. Or, I appreciate what Jesus did, but I am comfortable in my own life. This person recognizes their sin, their need for Christ, and chooses to reject their only hope for salvation because they want control of their life. But the only thing these people are maintaining is their illusion of control, not control itself. For biblically speaking, all control is given to us from God in the hope that we would wisely steward it for His glory. So this person does not gain control if they never owned it to begin with. Because at the end, every knee will bow to God and every tongue shall swear allegiance to Him. This is something that God swears by the highest thing there is, Himself, in Isaiah 45:23. And Paul in Philippians 2 attributes this same phraseology to the very Savior that this objector has rejected. I am aware that the objector might not believe in Isaiah or Paul, but I am nonetheless giving a biblical answer. So that addresses some of the major objections you will hear to the atonement. At this point, I will summarize what we have covered and give some implications of it. We started by asking the question, how do I solve my sin? Knowing that sin was not meant in the religious sense, only in the generic sense of falling short of a moral standard. But if one accepts the condition, they must necessarily say three other things, which is that a morally perfect standard exists that can only be God, and that we are morally accountable to Him. So God is both standard and judge, which I showed through argument. We then addressed proposed solutions to this problem, all of which failed, at which point we introduced the only logically possible solution to our sin, a substitute. That is, the only way for God to punish sin without punishing the sinner is to punish someone in the sinner's place. We then said that the Christian gospel is the only religion to offer this, making it the only available solution to sin. The major implication of this is in how we, but particularly objectors to the Christian faith, approach the gospel. It is often approached with a degree of extreme skepticism and animosity. The gospel is treated as an enemy that needs to be destroyed at all costs, and will only be accepted if the Christian can give absolute proof beyond a shadow of a doubt that their religion is true. In other words, the objector says to the Christian, "You must twist my arm to get me to accept the gospel." But given what was stated in this video, the gospel is not our enemy, it is our only hope. Remember from Finding Nemo, fish are friends, not food. The gospel is not our enemy. The second implication is that the premises of the gospel are self-evident. This means that the situation for those who haven't heard the gospel is not as hopeless as some would think, but I will discuss this in more detail in the appendix so as to not distract us from the main argument. Now that the main argument is finished, allow me a few minutes to illustrate the certainty of the assurance of salvation for those who trust the Christian substitute. This presupposes the basic truth of the Bible, which will be defended later in this series. So, assurance of salvation refers to the certainty one has that they are saved from their sin, and I think that one can be certain of their salvation in large part because of who guarantees it. This is the assurance that comes through faith. Although in the Bible other means of assurance exist, such as a change in one's motivations, having correct doctrine, or showing good works, these only occur as a result of faith. So for a new believer, most of what they have for assurance is their faith. And in my opinion, this faith is meant to form the bedrock of assurance even for mature believers. Lest one reject that we are ultimately assured by faith because of its non-scientific nature, we do this all the time. For example, when we throw a ball in the air, we have faith that gravity will pull it back to the earth. We can never be logically certain that gravity won't turn off, but we are nonetheless assured in our faith because we know that gravity is an unchangeable law. We could say that the degree of certainty that our faith produces is dependent on the strength of its object. And gravity is fairly certain, but how much more certain would our assurance be for salvation from sin if it lies in the one who, according to Hebrews, upholds the universe by the word of his power, gravity included. Christ is more sure than gravity and more steady than any earthly rock we could stand on. Our assurance, the assurance that comes from faith, can be certain because of who Christ is. For we have already established that whatever our substitute S is uncaused, has no beginning, is immaterial, supernatural, sovereign, alive, willful, absolute, rational, and its character is moral perfection. And most importantly, S is not us, and Christ is all of those things. For instance, the Bible says that Christ upholds the universe by the word of his power. Elsewhere, it says that the universe was created through him. So, he is the source of the laws that govern mathematics. So when will God's promises fail for those who trust him? They will fail on the same day that 2 + 2 = 5, because his absolute nature guarantees that both 2 + 2 = 4 and the salvation of those who trust him. And when will he fail to deliver those who love him? On the same day that logic becomes undone, when things literally cease to be equal with themselves. And when will we have to add our own merit to what he has accomplished on the cross? On the same day that gravity pushes outwards and not inwards, and magnets no longer attract each other. Because his sovereign nature guarantees both that the natural laws of this universe are upheld and that the price for our sin was paid in full on the cross. And we know that Christ's character is the source of morality. So when will he fail to forgive those who throw themselves on his sacrifice? On the same day that loving others becomes morally wrong and hating them becomes right, for his perfect moral character guarantees them both. Christ is better than good, more honest than honesty, more loving than love. We do not merely describe him in terms of virtues, for he is virtue. It is intrinsic to who he is. And we have the laws of mathematics, logic, nature, and morality to testify of his reliability. So what could possibly separate those who gaze upon Christ's work from his love? Paul says that neither tribulation nor distress, nor persecution or famine or nakedness or danger or sword, neither height nor depth, nor anything else in all creation can separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord. For the work required for our salvation has been truly finished. Colossians 2:13-14 says that God has made us alive together with him, having forgiven us all our trespasses by canceling the record of debt that stood against us with its legal demands. This he set aside, nailing it to the cross. But what about faith? Is this an obstacle to access these promises? To some it is. To the self-righteous Jews it was a stumbling block, and to the Greeks it was foolishness. But for everyone who calls on the name of the Lord, they will be saved. That is Joel 2:32. That means that everyone who trusts in who Christ is and his ability to save them, they will be saved, and they can rest in that, knowing that it doesn't depend on them. For Christ is our Sabbath rest. But wait a minute, isn't there some merit on our part that is required to exercise faith? No, for that would be treating faith as though it were a work, which the Bible clearly separates it from. Romans 4 Verse 5 says, "And to the one who does not work, but believes in him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is counted as righteousness." So faith, or as Paul puts it, believing, is not working. I take this to mean that it requires no moral effort to exercise. Its only value is found in who it is in, Christ. And God counts it as righteousness, not because it is righteous in and of itself, but because through it the righteousness of Christ is given to the ungodly. Likewise, Romans 3:27 says that boasting is excluded by the law of faith. Faith is not something we boast in. It is not a work. As it is, faith is not for those who are well. It is for those who know they are sick. Faith is not for the full. It is for those who know they are empty. Jesus said in Matthew 5:6, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied." So, faith is not for the righteous. It is for those who know they are depraved. Faith is not for those who pretend they have no sin. It is for those who know they meet condition 1 and are ready to cast their hope on a substitute. Jesus said in Matthew 11:28, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." So if one is concerned that they lack the goodness to have faith, I think they are in a better position than ever to have this faith they seek. If one is asking themselves questions like, "Do I trust Christ perfectly?" Or if they are concerned that they cannot exercise saving faith because of their sin, then it is possible that they are treating faith as a work. As it is, faith is not an obstacle only to be overcome by the spiritual elite. For it is said that as one's awareness of two things is enhanced, that their own sin and God's holy standard, that the perceived moral gap between themselves and God grows. But that gap is continually bridged by the cross. As our perception of the gap grows, so does our perception of the cross. But this implies that one looks to the cross for our assurance and not their ability to have faith. In other words, stop treating faith as a work. Faith has no value except in its object, Christ, so focus on him. Like Peter, keep your eyes on Christ and don't look away. Focus on his ability to save. Don't worry about faith, for gazing at Christ and his work is biblical faith. In this way, the statement, "Christ saves me," is true for all who acknowledge it, provided that they have a basic understanding of who Christ is and what he saves us from. Those who do this can have what Hebrews 6:19 calls a sure and steadfast anchor of the soul, which remains even in the most difficult of times. As a result, they can enjoy full fellowship for all eternity with a God who both created them and loves them enough to die in their place. Maybe you have not trusted in Christ yet. Maybe you are unfamiliar with the scriptures and aren't sure yet. And I encourage you to look at the scriptures, yes, but also to be consistent with what you already believe. That means take condition 1 to its logical conclusion, a substitute for your sin, and trust your substitute that is Christ. If you have listened to this video and now realize that the voice of your conscience has been bearing witness all along that the Christian gospel is true, then I urge you with David, today if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. Take your sin to its logical solution, Cast all your weight on your substitute, for he is able to bear it. That marks the end of the main content of the video. I have made my case, shown its implications, and made a plea to the skeptic to follow their sin to its logical solution. In the next video, I will begin an appendix which will show in even more detail how closely the only logical solution to sin aligns with what the Bible says, as well as how the Bible predicts most of man's failed solutions. The arguments presented there are not quite bulletproof, but are nonetheless worth considering. I hope to see you there.